3 hours. That's all it took for one phone call to destroy a family's reputation. My neighbor Karen thought she was being clever when she called the police to find my grandfather for refusing to join her little HOA kingdom. But she had no idea that the harmless old man she was targeting carried something more powerful than she'd ever touched in her entire life. And when that something appeared, her smug smile vanished instantly, leaving behind a collapse that left the entire neighborhood stunned. This is about arrogance, the lies of power, and Afanel you'll never forget. Buckle up and comment where you're watching from, because the truth is more shocking than anything you could imagine. The morning it all started, I was sitting on my front porch reading the Denver Post, my fingers absently stroking the old flip phone in my pocket. Not out of fear, mind you, but because I was waiting for an important call from an old friend. The autumn air carried that crisp bite that reminded me why I'd chosen Colorado for retirement. That and everything felt perfectly peaceful until Vivian Cross came marching down Maple Grove Street like a general inspecting troops. She had her usual arsenal, a thick clipboard, a laser measuring device that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and that ever-present camera she used to document every perceived violation in your quiet neighborhood. What Vivian didn't know was that I'd been secretly in contact with Agent Martinez since yesterday, not to ask for help but to set up a trap. "Mr. Reeves," she shrieked, her voice carrying that particular pitch that made dogs howl 3 blocks away, "I've measured your gate again, and it's still 4.2 feet high. That's a clear violation of our HOA regulation, limiting barriers to 4 feet maximum." She waved her laser device like it was some kind of legal document, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the plastic casing. I sat down my newspaper and looked at her with that kind of calm that comes from 30 years of dealing with people. "Far more dangerous than a suburban tyrant with a god complex, Vivian," I said, keeping my voice level. "As I've explained before, this house predates your HOA by 15 years. I'm not subject to your regulations." Her face turned that particular shade of red that meant she was about to escalate things beyond reason, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she calculated her next move. What happened next was classic Vivian Cross. Instead of accepting the simple truth, she pulled out a thick manila envelope and slapped it down on my porch table with the kind of dramatic flair that belonged in a courtroom drama. "Legal notice from Hartman and Associates," she announced loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "You have 24 hours to either pay the $500 fine and sign this compliance agreement, or face a $15,000 civil suit for endangering community safety." I picked up the documents and scanned them, my trained eye immediately catching the legal inconsistencies that would have been invisible to most people. This wasn't just about HOA fees and neighborhood compliance. The fine print contained language about partial property rights transfer that no legitimate HOA would ever require. Vivian wasn't just trying to collect money, she was trying to steal pieces of people's ships inside the house. I could hear my granddaughter Emma's video call getting interrupted by the shouting, and through the window I caught sight of her face creased with worry. She'd been living with me for 3 years now, ever since her parents died in a car accident, and I'd promised myself I'd give her the peaceful, stable life deserved. But sometimes peace requires fighting for it, and Emma was about to learn that her grandfather wasn't quite the quiet retiree she thought he was. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I called through the screen door loud enough for her to hear, but soft enough that Vivian couldn't catch the words. "Your old grandpa has dealt with much worse than this." What I didn't say was that the lawyer Vivian kept mentioning, this Hartman character, was a name I recognized from a case that had kept me awake for 3 years before my retirement. Mrs. Peterson from next door had appeared at her window, and I could see her holding up her phone. But she wasn't just watching like usual. She was recording something she'd been doing for months now, documenting every interaction with Vivian in case things ever went to court. Mr. Peterson stood behind her, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the window frame, and you could see the fear in both their faces. They'd been paying Vivian's fees for 2 years now, bleeding their retirement savings for violations that probably didn't even exist. But they were too scared to fight back, too worried about legal consequences they couldn't afford. That's how bullies like Vivian operated. They found people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back, then squeezed them until there was nothing left to take. "You have until tomorrow morning, Mr. Reeves," Vivian said, her voice dripping with the kind of satisfaction that comes from believing you hold all the cards. "After that, I'm calling the police, and you'll discover that this community doesn't tolerate people who think they're above our rules. I've already spoken to Channel 7 News about this situation, and I'm sure they'd be very interested in a story about an elderly man threatening neighborhood safety." She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house, her measuring device swinging from her belt like some kind of suburban sword. But as she walked away, I noticed something she probably thought I'd missed. Her hands were trembling just slightly, and that told me everything I needed to know. Real criminals, the dangerous ones I'd spent my career chasing, never showed fear. They were too confident, too sure of their control. But Vivian was scared, which meant she was in over her head with something bigger than neighborhood politics. As I watched her disappear into her house, I pulled out my flip phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 6 months. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the street, and I could see lights coming on in windows up and down the block. Normal families settling in for normal evenings, unaware that their peaceful little neighborhood was about to become the center of something much larger than anyone imagined. I thought I understood Vivian's game, her petty power plays, and manufactured violations. But when I read through those legal documents more carefully, I realized the truth was far more sinister. The lawyer she kept mentioning, this Marcus Hartman, whose name was signed at the bottom of the legal notice, wasn't just some local attorney looking to make a quick buck. He was the same Marcus Hartman I'd been chasing for 3 years per my retirement, the one who'd always stayed one step ahead of every trap I'd set, the one who specialized in elderly fraud and had stolen millions from retirement communities across the western states. And now he'd found his way to my quiet Denver neighborhood, targeting the people I'd sworn to protect. The next morning brought Vivian's escalation in full force, but she'd traded her usual livestream tactics for something more insidious. By 7 a.m. I found 200 bright yellow flyers taped to every mailbox, streetlight, and telephone pole within a 3-block radius. Warning: dangerous resident refuses to comply with safety regulations blazed across the top in bold red letters, complete with a grainy photo of my front gate that she'd taken with a telephoto lens. The flyers, madam, sound like some kind of neighborhood menace, refusing to follow community safety protocols and threatening fuel fare of local families. What impressed me in a grudging professional way was how she'd managed to make my legal 4-foot gate sound like a military fortification designed to terrorize small children. But Vivian wasn't done with her multimedia approach. Around 9 a.m., a van from the Denver Post pulled up outside my house, and I watched through my kitchen window as she gave an animated interview to a young reporter who looked like she'd rather be covering anything else. From my position, I could hear fragments of Vivian's performance. Elderly man refuses to follow basic safety rules. Unity feels threatened. The reporter scribbled notes with the enthusiasm of someone filling a quota, but I noticed she kept glancing at my house with a skeptical expression. Real journalists develop a nose for it, and even from a distance, I could tell this one was picking up a distinct odor from Vivian's story. By 10:30, 2 private security guards in matching nav uniforms had set up folding chairs directly across from my front porch, complete with a banner that read "Under HOA Investigation." They looked bored and slightly embarrassed, probably wondering how their careers had led them to babysitting a suburban drama queen's vendetta against a 75-year-old retiree. But their presence sent a clear message to the neighborhood. Vivian Cross meant business, and anyone who crossed her would face similar treatment. I had to admit it was an effective intimidation tactic. Most people would have caved by now, signed whatever papers she wanted just to make the humiliation stop. I decided it was time for some old-school detective work, instead of hiding behind my curtains like Vivian probably expected. I took a walk around their neighborhood, observing details with the systematic approach that had served me well for 3 decades in federal law enforcement. What I found was disturbing. 12 houses had brand new security cameras that all seemed to point toward common areas rather than protecting the homeowner's property. 8 houses showed signs of recent lock changes, but the old deadbolt holes were still visible, suggesting that changes weren't voluntary. And everywhere I looked, I saw the small signs of a community under siege. Lowered voices, hurried movements, the kind of fearful body language that comes from living under constant surveillance. My first real conversation was with Harold Peterson from next door, a 72-year-old retired postal worker whose hands shook when he handed me a stack of papers. "Sterling," he whispered, glancing around like he was worried about being overheard. "Margaret and I have been paying Vivian for 2 years now. Started with $3,000 for improper house paint color, then another $2,000 for maintenance assessments. Now she wants $5,000 more for something called community security upgrades." His voice cracked slightly as he continued. "We've been married 48 years, and we've never been late on a bill or broken a rule in your lives, but she makes us feel like criminals in our neighborhood." The papers he'd given me were a collection of official-looking notices, each one more threatening than the last, all bearing the letterhead of Hartman and Associates. When I got back to the house, Emma was waiting for me with her laptop open and a determined expression her 16-year-old face. "Grandpa," she said, "I've been doing some research on this Vivian person, and I found some really weird stuff." She'd managed to access the neighborhood Facebook group and discovered that 23 families had been hit with similar violations, totaling over $47,000 in the past 2 years. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a thread where Jake and Lisa Sullivan had admitted they'd taken a second mortgage in their house to pay Vivian's fees. "These people are scared to death of her. Some of them are talking about moving away rather than keeping fighting." Emma's digital native skills had uncovered what my walking survey had suggested. This wasn't random harassment, it was systematic financial exploitation. But then Emma made a discovery that changed everything. While scrolling through property records, she'd found something that made my blood run cold. "Grandpa, according to the city database, there's no registered HOA for Maple Grove. There never has been. Vivian Cross is just some lady collecting money and calling herself resident of an organization that doesn't legally exist. I stared at the screen, watching my granddaughter Fisfans navigate through official city websites with a kind of expertise that made me simultaneously proud and terrified for her generation. This confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Vivian wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor. She was running a full-scale fraud operation, and Marcus Hartman was providing the legal muscle to make it look legitimate. That afternoon, Vivian struck back with her most audacious move yet. She'd organized what she called an emergency community safety meeting right there on the public sidewalk in front of my house, complete with folding chairs arranged in a semicircle and a small portable microphone system. About 30 neighbors showed up, most of them looking uncomfortable but curious. Vivian held court like some kind of suburban dictator, pointing at my house and explaining how my refusal to comply with community standards was putting everyone at risk. "This man," she declared, her voice amplified for maximum dramatic effect, "has turned our peaceful neighborhood into a place where children can't play safely, where property values are threatened, and where law-abiding citizens live in fear." It was a masterful performance, I had to admit, mixing just enough truth with complete fabrication to make the whole thing sound plausible to people who didn't know the real story. As I watched this circus from my living room window, I realized Vivian had made a crucial tactical error. By dragging with the media into this, by making it a public spectacle, she'd opened the door for the kind of scrutiny that professional criminals usually tried to avoid. But that also meant she was feeling desperate, pushed into escalating faster than she'd probably intended. I thought I understood her game, her petty power plays, and manufactured violations. But when Emma showed me that interview request from Channel 7 News sitting in my email inbox, I knew something much bigger was about to unfold. The reporter wanted to hear my side of the story, which meant Vivian's narrative was already starting to crumble, and tomorrow, when she made good on her threat to call the police, she was going to get a surprise that would make this afternoon's drama look like a warm-up. The phone call that changed everything came at exactly 8:47 a.m. while Emma was getting ready for her online classes. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her answer with her usual cheerful hello followed by a long pause that made me look up from my morning routine. This is Emma Reeves," she said, her voice suddenly uncertain. "You're looking for my grandfather and your FBI." The cafe mag slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, sending ceramic fragments skittering across the linoleum. In 30 years of federal service, I'd never brought my work home, never let my family become entangled in the dangerous world I navigated daily. But apparently that world had finally caught up with us. Emma walked into the kitchen holding the phone like it might explode, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fear. "Grandpa," she whispered, covering the receiver. "There's an Agent Martinez on the phone asking for Sterling Reeves. He says it's about some documents you sent him yesterday." I took the phone with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, given that my careful Lincoln-struck retirement was about to collapse. "Martinez," I said, recognizing the voice immediately. "Tell me you've had a chance to verify what I sent." His response confirmed my worst fears. "Sterling, those bank routing numbers identified match 3 major fraud investigations we've been running in California, Texas, and Nevada. We need to talk, and we need to talk today." I glanced at Emma, who was standing frozen by the kitchen island, and realized that keeping my granddaughter in the dark was no longer an option. After I hung up, Emma crossed her arms and fixed me with kind of stare that could have melted steel. "Grandpa, what the hell is going on? Why is the FBI calling our house? What documents did you send them? And don't you dare tell me it's nothing, because I'm not stupid." The hurt in her voice cut deeper than any criminal's threat ever had. For 3 years I'd been just her grandfather, the quiet retiree who helped with homework and made pancakes on Saturday mornings. But Emma deserved the truth, especially since she was about to be pulled into something much larger than a neighborhood dispute. I led her to my home office, a room she'd always assumed was just where I paid bills and stored old photographs, and opened the door to reveal 30 years of carefully organized case files, federal credentials, and the tools of a profession I'd never really left behind. The look on Emma's face when I pulled out my FBI badge and identification was a mething between awe and betrayal. "Your FBI," she whispered, handling the badge like it was made of glass. "Like real federal agent FBI, not just some security guard who likes to pretend." I sat down heavily in my desk chair and began pulling out files that I'd hoped never to need again. Was FBI sweetheart. 30 years in the Financial Crimes Division, specializing in elder fraud and organized theft rings. I retired 3 years ago when your parents died because I wanted to focus on raising you properly. But as I explained about Marcus Hartman, the lawyer whose name kept appearing on Vivian's legal documents, Emma's expression shifted from shock to understanding to something that looked dangerously like excitement. Marcus Hartman had been my white whale, the one case that got away before my retirement. Between 2018 and 2021, he'd orchestrated a series of fake HOA and property management scams that had stolen over $2 million from elderly communities across the western United States. Every time we got close, he'd disappear, leaving behind and forged documents while his victims struggled to prove they'd been defrauded. The case files I showed Emma contained surveillance photos, financial records, and victim statements that painted a picture of a man who specialized in targeting vulnerable communities where people trusted their neighbors and didn't question official paperwork. He's not just some small-time neighborhood lawyer, I explained to Emma as she scrolled through digital photos on my tablet. He's a predator who's perfected the art of stealing people's homes right out from under them. The real revelation came when I showed Emma the surveillance equipment I'd been using for the past 2 weeks. Hidden cameras positioned around my property had captured not just Vivian's theatrical performances, but 3 separate meetings between her and a man who matched Marcus Hartman's description perfectly. They'd met at the Starbucks on Fairfax Avenue, at Cherry Creek Mall. And most damning of all was in the parking lot behind the Wells Fargo branch where several of Vivian's victims had been forced to withdraw large cash payments. Emma, I said, watching her study the photographs with a kind of analytical intensity that reminded me of myself at her age. What we're dealing with isn't just a neighborhood bully. This is organized crime. And your old grandfather walked right into the middle of their newest operation. But Emma surprised me with her response. Instead of fear or anger, she rolled up her sleeves and cracked her knuckles like she was preparing for battle. Okay, she said, turning to face me with a determination that made my chest swell with pride. So, we're going to catch them, right? I mean, if you were good enough to almost catch this Hartman guy before, and now he's right here in our neighborhood, we can't just let him keep stealing from people like the Petersons. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but it also terrified me. The last thing I wanted was to drag my 16-year-old granddaughter into a federal investigation. But Emma had already pulled up property records on her laptop and was cross-referencing addresses with the bank account information I'd gathered. By noon, we'd established that Vivian Cross had been operating under at least 4 different business names, all of them connected to bank accounts that showed highly suspicious deposit patterns. Emma's digital skills, combined with my investigative experience, created a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than either of us had expected. This wasn't just about Maple Grove. We'd stumbled onto what appeared to be the nerve center of a multi-state operation that had been targeting retirement communities systematically. Grandpa, Emma said, pointing to a series of transactions on her screen. If these numbers are right, they've stolen almost $130,000. Just from our neighborhood in the past 18 months. That afternoon, Vivian escalated her campaign with a mover that showed just how desperate she was becoming. She'd hired a private investigator to dig into my background, and by 3:00 p.m., rumors were circulating that I might be a registered sex offender or have some kind of criminal history that I was hiding from the community. It was a classic deflection tactic designed to discredit me before he could expose what she was doing, but it also meant she was feeling cornered. The fact that she was willing to resort to character assassination suggested that Marcus Hartman was pushing her to close this operation quickly, probably because my presence had made him nervous. When Emma showed me the text messages circulating among her classmates' parents asking whether it was safe for their children to walk past our house, I knew we were running out of time. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when my hidden camera captured something that made my blood run cold. Marcus Hartman arrived at Vivian's house that evening, but this time, he wasn't alone. The man with him was someone I recognized from old case files, someone who'd been connected to elder fraud operations in 6 different states. More importantly, I could see through my telephoto lens that Hartman was carrying a manila folder that looked suspicious, like the kind of personal dossier that indicated they knew exactly who I was. As I watched Emma decode the license plate numbers and cross-reference them with federal databases, I realized that tomorrow, when Vivian made good on her threat to call the police, we wouldn't just be dealing with a neighborhood dispute, we'd be walking into a confrontation that could either end Marcus Hartman's criminal career for good or put my granddaughter and me in more danger than I'd ever intended to face in retirement. Vivian's final escalation began at 6 a.m. sharp with a 911 call that could be heard through her open windows 3 houses away. "I need police assistance immediately," she declared into her phone with a kind of theatrical projection that suggested she wanted the entire neighborhood to witness her moment of triumph. "I have concrete evidence that a resident is concealing his true identity and poses a direct threat to community safety. This man has been intimidating neighbors, refusing to comply with legal orders, and I have reason to believe he may have a criminal background that he's hiding from all of us." As I listened from my kitchen window, I had to admire her commitment to the performance. Even though every word was carefully calculated to create maximum drama for the cameras, she'd undoubtedly arranged to document her victory. But Vivian wasn't content with just one avenue of attack. While she was on the phone with emergency services, her laptop was simultaneously sending emails to every member of the Denver City Council, complete with what she called a petition by 31 concerned residents, demanding an immediate investigation into my background and residency status. The petition itself was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation and full of official-sounding language about community safety protocols and residential compliance verification that made her vendetta sound like legitimately sick concern. What made it particularly insidious was how she'd managed to collect real signatures from neighbors who had no idea what they were endorsing. People who thought they were just supporting neighborhood safety improvements. By 7:30, Vivian had assembled her largest crowd yet. 47 people gathered on the sidewalk in front of my house, many of them carrying professionally printed signs that read, "Protect our families and transparency in our community." The speed with which to organize this demonstration suggested planning that went far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute, and I could see Marcus Hartman's influence in the sophisticated messaging and legal-sounding demands. What caught my attention, though, was how many of the protesters looked uncomfortable, glancing around nervously like they weren't entirely sure why they were there or what they were protesting against. From my living room, I could see Emma setting up multiple camera angles to record everything that was about to unfold, her teenage tech savvy proving invaluable as she created watch-called evidence insurance in case things went sideways. But I was dealing with a more immediate problem. Vivian had somehow managed to get the power shut off to our entire block by filing what she claimed was an emergency electrocalcify report with the city utilities department. Sitting in my darkened house, watching the crowd grow large, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 30 years of federal law enforcement. Genuine uncertainty about whether my preparation would be enough to handle what was coming. The real blow came when Vivian's private investigator approached the crowd with a stack of documents that he claimed proved I had a hidden criminal history and had been living under pretenses for years. The papers were fabricated, but they looked official enough to convince people who were already primed to believe the worst. I watched through my window as neighbors I'd shared pleasant conversations with for 3 years began nodding and whispering among themselves, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion to something that looked dangerously like anger. It was a masterful piece of character assassination designed to isolate me completely before the authorities arrived. When 3 police cruisers finally pulled up at 8:15, their red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of houses throughout the neighborhood, I felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Officer Johnson Rodriguez and Captain Hayes stepped out of their vehicles into a scene that looked more like a civil rights protest than a neighborhood dispute, complete with Vivian standing at a makeshift podium with a microphone, addressing the crowd like some kind of suburban revolutionary. "Thank you all for coming," she announced to the assembled neighbors and the cameras that we're recording everything. "Today, we take our community back from those who think they can intimidate and deceive honest, law-abiding families." Captain Hayes approached my front door with a kind of professional weariness that comes from 20 years of responding to domestic disputes. But I could see in his eyes that he was already skeptical about whatever story had brought him here. "Mr. Reeves," he said when I opened the door, "we've received multiple reports about some kind of residential compliance issue and there are allegations about false identification or background information. Would you mind if we discussed this situation?" His tone was respectful but firm, and I appreciated that he was treating this as a legitimate inquiry rather than automatically assuming I was guilty of whatever Vivian had accused me of. But I could also see that the crowd behind him was creating pressure for a quick resolution. And quick resolutions rarely favored the person being accused. "Captain Hayes," I replied, stepping onto my porch so that my voice would carry to the assembled crowd, "I want to discuss this situation, but I think there are some things you should know before we proceed. And I suspect that you understand what's happening here. You're going to want to call for backup." The confusion on his face was exactly what I'd expected. But before he could respond, Mrs. Peterson emerged from her house carrying something that made Vivian's face go pale. A shoe box filled with audio recordings, fake Lego documents, and financial records that she'd been secretly collecting for months. Officer Mrs. Peterson called out in a voice that was stronger than I'd heard from her in years. "Before you listen to another word from that woman, you need to hear what she's been doing to this neighborhood. I have 6 months of recordings that prove she's been systematically threatening and defrauding every family on this block." The crowd began to murmur as she approached, holding her evidence like a weapon, and I could see Vivian frantically trying to delete something from her phone while simultaneously shouting objections that nobody seemed to be listening to anymore. But what changed the atmosphere was the arrival of an unmarked sedan that pulled up behind the police cars. Agent Martinez stepped out wearing his federal credentials prominently displayed, and I could see Captain Hayes' interior demeanor shift as he recognized that this neighborhood dispute had just become something much more complex. Captain Martinez called out as he approached, "I'm Agent Martinez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. We've been coordinating with Mr. Reeves on an ongoing investigation, and I believe the complaints you've received today are directly related to our case." The crowd fell silent as the implications of federal involvement began to sink in, and I watched Vivian's confident expression crumble into something that looked like pure panic. Just as he thought the situation was stabilizing, a black luxury sedan with tinted windows appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly toward our gathering like a predator approaching prey. Through the passenger window, I caught a glimpse of her face that made my blood freeze. Marcus Hartman, the man I'd been chasing for 3 years, apparently deciding that he needed to personally manage this crisis. As the car drew closer, I realized that everything we'd planned for was about to be tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. The neighborhood dispute was about to become a federal case, but Marcus Hartman's presence meant that the real danger was just the beginning, and my granddaughter and I were standing at the center of what could either be the end of his criminal career or the beginning of something far more dangerous than a simple fraud investigation. What do you think you would have done in Sterling's situation, knowing that a federal criminal was approaching while you're surrounded by neighbors who might still believe you're the real threat? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and let me know if you think Sterling made the right choice in revealing his background to Emma. I'm Jason Miller coming to you from Chicago, and trust me, what happens? The moment I'd been building toward for 30 years of federal service arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes time seem to slow down. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the leather case I'd carried through 3 decades of investigations, placing my FBI badge and credentials on the porch table where every camera, every neighbor, and every police officer could see them. The reaction was immediate and electric. Captain Hayes stepped back in recognition. Several neighbors gasped audibly, and Vivian Cross went from Paleto ghostly white in the span of 3 heartbeats. "Agent Sterling Reeves," Captain Hayes said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and surprise. "Sir, I remember you from the Denver housing fraud task force in 2018. You were field investigator on Operation Clean House." The crowd that had been so vocal just minutes earlier fell into the kind-of silence usually reserved for churches and courtrooms. Agent Martinez stepped forward to confirm what was already becoming obvious to everyone present. Sterling Reeves, 30 years with the FBI Financial Crimes Division, specializing in elder fraud and organized theft operations, he announced to the assembled crowd. "Mr. Reeves has been working with our office on an investigation that appears to be directly connected to the complaints filed against him today." The implications hit the crowd like a physical wave, and I could see neighbors looking at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to embarrassment. Signs that had demanded my investigation were slowly being glowered, and several people in the back of the crowd began quietly slipping away, suddenly realizing they'd been manipulated into participating in something they didn't understand. Vivian collapse was as spectacular as it was complete. She stared at my badge like it was some kind of supernatural artifact, her mouth opening and clasping without producing any sound. The clipboard that had been her constant companion clattered to the sidewalk, followed by her laser measuring device, which bounced twice before coming to rest against the curb. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. You're supposed to be. This isn't possible." She took 3 unsteady steps backward, her designer heels clicking against the concrete before her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the sidewalk in a heap of expensive clothing and shattered arrogance. Emma, watching from our front window, would later tell me that Vivian's fall looked like something from a movie, complete with perfectly timed dramatic lighting from the morning sun. But Marcus Hartman wasn't going to let his operation collapse without a fight. He emerged from the black sedan with the kind of confident swagger that suggested Hestel believed he could salvage the situation through sheer audacity. "I'm Marcus Hartman, legal counsel for Miss Cross," he announced to Captain Hayes, pulling out his own credentials with a flourish. "This appears to be some kind-of federal overreach designed to intimidate my client, and I demand to know under what authority this investigation is being conducted." His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to using legal jargon to confuse and intimidate people, but he'd made a crucial error in judgment. The moment he identified himself by name, Agent Martinez stepped forward with handcuffs already in his hands. "Marcus Hartman," Martinez said with obvious satisfaction, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit mail fraud, wire fraud, and organized theft targeting elderly victims. You have the right to remain silent, though I suspect you're going to want to use that right extensively." The transformation in Hartman's demeanor was immediate and complete. The confident lawyer disappeared, replaced by a man who suddenly understood that 3 years of staying one step ahead of federal investigators had finally come to an end. As Martinez read him his rights, I could see Vivian slowly regaining consciousness in the back of the ambulance, her eyes focusing just in time to watch her criminal partner being gulled away in handcuffs. While the paramedics worked on Vivian, I began presenting the evidence that Emma and I had spent weeks collecting to Captain Hayes and Agent Martinez. The 3 folders of documentation told a story that was both more extensive and more damaging than even I had suspected. 8 fraudulent bank accounts, systematic theft of over $127,000 from 23 families in this neighborhood alone, and a paper trail that connects this operation to similar schemes in 12 other states, I explained, watching Theophos's expressions grow more serious with each revelation. Mrs. Peterson approached with her box of recordings, adding her evidence to the growing pile of documentation that would ensure both Vivian and Hartman faced serious federal charges. The community response was a mixture of relief, anger, and genuine grief, as neighbors began to understand the scope of what had been done to them. Harold Peterson stepped forward first, his voice shaking with emotion. Ash addressed the remaining crowd. My wife and I gave that woman $5,000 over 2 years because we thought we had to, because we were scared of what would happen if we didn't, he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. We've been living in fear in our neighborhood, afraid to have friends visit, afraid to even work in our garden because she might find something else to find us for. His words opened the floodgates, and one by one, other neighbors began sharing their own stories of financial exploitation and psychological intimidation. Jake Sullivan, the young father who'd taken a second mortgage to pay Vivian's fees, summed up what everyone was feeling when he said wet rusted her because she seemed official, because she had lawyers and legal documents, and because we didn't. No any better. How do you fight someone who claims to represent the law when you don't understand the law yourself? His question highlighted the sophisticated nature of the fraud. Vivian and Hartman had created an entire ecosystem of fake authority, designed to exploit people's natural inclination to follow rules and avoid conflict with officials. As Vivian was helped into the ambulance, still groggy but conscious enough to understand what was happening around her, she made one last attempt to maintain her innocence. I was protecting this community, she called out weakly, her voice lacking any of its former authority. Everything I did was legal. Everything was documented. But her protests fell on deaf ears because evidence was overwhelming. And more importantly, after all, the people she'd been exploiting for 2 years were finally free to speak the truth about what she'd put them through. The ambulance doors closed on what had been just that morning the most powerful person in our neighborhood and drove away carrying someone who was now just another suspect in a federal fraud investigation. But even as we celebrated this victory, I knew the story was far from over. Agent Martinez pulled me aside as the crowd began to disperse and delivered news that confirmed my worst fears. The documents recovered from Hartman's car indicated that Maple Grove was just one small piece of a much larger criminal enterprise. Sterling, he said quietly. We've identified connections to similar operations in 47 different communities across 12 states. This isn't just about your neighborhood anymore. This is about taking down an entire network of criminals who've been systematically in elderly Americans for years. As I looked around at my neighbors, finally free from the fear that had done their lives for so long, I realized that our little victory was about to become the opening battle in a much larger war against organized elder fraud. The scope of what we'd uncovered became clear when Agent Martinez's phone rang at exactly 2:30 that afternoon. Just as our neighborhood was beginning to feel like it might return to normal, I watched his expression change from satisfaction to serious concern as he listened to whoever was calling from Fear headquarters. When he hung up, he turned to me with the kind of look that meant our quiet retirement was about to become significantly less quiet. Sterling, he said, pulling me away from the dispersing crowd of neighbors. That was Director Williams calling from Washington. The documents we recovered from Hartman's vehicle have connected your Maple Grove operation to 47 similar fraud schemes across 12 different states. We're looking at the largest organized elder fraud network in FBI history. Emma, who had been documenting everything with her camera equipment, overheard enough of the conversation to understand that our family was about to be pulled into something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. She approached us with her laptop open, showing digital evidence that made my federal training kick into high gear. Grandpa, she said, her voice carrying the kind of excitement that worried me. I've been cross-referencing the bank routing numbers from Vivian's documents with public fraud reports, and I found connections to elderly communities in California, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, and 8 other states. The total amount stolen isn't $127,000, it's over $12.80. $1 million from nearly 2,000 families. Her research skills had uncovered what would normally take a federal task force weeks to compile. Andy felt simultaneously proud of her abilities and terrified of how deep we were getting into dangerous territory. The call that changed everything came at 3:15. When Director Williams himself contacted me directly. I hadn't spoken to the director since my retirement ceremony 3 years earlier, and hearing his voice brought back memories of cases that had consumed years of my life. Sterling, he said without preamble, we need you back. Not permanently, but as lead consultant on Operation Neighborhood Shield. You're the only agent who successfully tracked Hartman's work thus far. And frankly, you're the only one these victims trust enough to tell us the whole truth about what's been done to them. The weight of that request settled on my shoulders like a familiar burden, and I found myself looking at Emma, knowing that accepting would mean putting both of us back into the kind of danger I'd tried to leave behind. Emma made the decision. For me, Grandpa, she said, having obviously overheard the entire conversation, you have to do this. There are almost 2,000 families out there going through exactly what the Petersons went through. Andy needs someone who understands how these criminals operate. Her maturity in that moment reminded me why I'd been so proud to be her guardian. But it also made me realize that my 16-year-old granddaughter had developed a moral compass that wouldn't let her grandfather walk away from people who needed help, even if helping them meant personal risk for our family. The interrogation of Vivian Cross revealed the true scope of her organization's cruelty and sophistication. Sitting in the FBI field office downtown with Agent Martinez and me conducting the interview, she finally broke down and told us the whole truth. Marcus Hartman and Richard Blackstone recruited me 18 months ago, she sobbed, her earlier arrogance completely gone. They said it would be easy money, just collecting fees from people who could afford to pay them. But when I tried to quit after the first month, they showed me photographs of my son Tommy at his college in Boulder. They knew his class schedule, his dormitory room number, even his girlfriend's name. The fear in her voice was genuine, and I realized that Vivian had been as much a victim of this organization as the neighbors she'd been extorting. Tommy Cross arrived at the FBI office that evening. A 19-year-old college student who'd been living in terror for over a year without understanding why. They never threatened me directly, he explained to Agent Martinez and me. But there was always someone watching, someone in the coffee shop where I studied, someone in their parking lot outside my dorm, someone taking pictures during my intramural soccer games. Mom never told me what washer pinning, but I could see how scared she was every time I called home. His testimony confirmed what Vivian had told us. Hartman and Blackstone maintained control over their network through systematic intimidation of family members, making it almost impossible for anyone to escape or seek help. The coordinated raids that followed were the largest simultaneous federal operation targeting elder fraud in American history. At exactly 6 a.m. Mountain Time, FBI teams in 12 states simultaneously executed search warrants on 31 locations, connected to what Widnow identified as the Hartman-Blackstone network. The operation recovered over $8.2 million in cash and fraudulent, arrested 67 suspects, and freed nearly 2,000 elderly victims from ongoing financial exploitation. Agent Martinez coordinated the entire operation from our Denver field office, with me providing consultation based on my knowledge of Hartman's previous operations, and Emma contributing digital forensics that helped track money transfers across state lines. But the most satisfying arrest was Richard Blackstone himself, captured at his compound outside Las Vegas, surrounded by luxury cars purchased with money stolen from retirement communities across the western United States. The man who'd been the puppet master behind Vivian's operation, who'd terrorized families like the Crosses and the Petersons, was finally facing federal charges that would put him away for the rest of his life. When Agent Martinez called to tell with me that Blackstone was in custody, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't experienced since my retirement 3 years earlier. The transformation in your Maple Grove neighborhood was immediate and profound. Within a week of Vivian's arrest, neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months were organizing block parties and community gardens. The Petersons hosted a barbecue, 40 families, celebrating not just the end of their financial nightmare, but the beginning of what Harold Peterson called the first real community we've had in years. Mrs. Peterson, who had been so afraid to speak up for so long, was elected president of our new Maple Grove Mutual Aid Society, an organization dedicated to helping neighbors without the kind of intimidation and financial exploitation that had characterized Vivian's fake HOA, Vivian Cross. Thanks to her cooperation with federal investigators, received a sentence that reflected both her crimes and her victimization: 18 months off house arrest, 500 hours of community service, and full restitution to everyone she defrauded. But more importantly, she stood before our community at a meeting in the local park and delivered what I believed was a genuine apology. "I hurt people I should have been protecting," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I let fear turn him into someone I never wanted to be, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did to all of you." Tommy Cross stood beside his mother, both of them committed to rebuilding their lives in Denver rather than running away from the consequences of their actions. Standing before my neighbors that evening, looking at faces that were relaxed and happy for the first time in years, I found myself thinking about what real community leadership looked like. The strength that matters, I told them, doesn't come from fear or intimidation or the power to collect fees and issue fines. It comes from neighbors who trust each other enough to speak up when something's wrong and who care enough about each other to listen when someone asks for help. But even as we celebrate a fist victory, I knew our story wasn't quite finished yet, because Emma had discovered something in the final documents that suggested the Hartman-Blackstone network was larger and more dangerous than even the FBI had. The package that arrived 1 week later made my blood run cold, but also confirmed that our fight had been worth every moment of danger. Inside the unmarked envelope were photographs of Emma taken 3 years ago in California, along with images of Tommy Cross and the Peterson family, all accompanied by a single typed note: "We never forget and will always collect our debts." Agent Martinez's analysis revealed that these photos had been taken by an international crime syndicate that made Hartman and Blackstone look like amateur criminals. But what struck me most was how all of the surveillance footage was. They'd been watching our family since before Emma had even come to live with him. Emma's reaction surprised me completely. Instead of fear, she showed the kind of calm determination that reminded me of myself at her age, but with technological sophistication I could never have imagined. Grandpa said, spreading the photos across our kitchen table like evidence. I've been researching this network since we at Blackstone in the past 5 years. 67 retired FBI agents have been systematically harassed by what appears to be the same organization. They're not just running elder fraud schemes, they're hunting the people who used to investigate them. Her analysis revealed a criminal organization that went far beyond anything I'd encountered in 30 years of federal service. The decision came down to a choice between hiding and fighting, and the Reeves family had never been the type to hide. We ought to have two options, I told Emma as we sat surrounded by federal protection offers and relocation brochures. We can disappear into witness protection and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, or we can turn Maple Grove into the kind of community that criminal organizations can't touch. Emma didn't hesitate. Grandpa, we've spent 3 years building a life here. These are our neighbors, our friends, our home. If some crime syndicate thinks they can scare us away, they're about to learn how wrong they are. The transformation of Maple Grove into what the FBI would later call the most crime-resistant neighborhood in Colorado became a model for community-based defense. Studidocracy, the country. I spent 6 months training 23 neighbors in basic security awareness, communication protocols, and situational awareness that had kept me alive through dangerous investigations. Mrs. Peterson coordinated neighborhood watch shifts operating 24 hours daily, while Jake Sullivan established an encrypted communication network allowing instant coordination between households. Tommy Cross became our liaison with younger residents, creating a defense network spanning multiple generations. The most powerful moment came when Vivian Cross, serving her community service sentence, asked to speak at one of our neighborhood meetings. I spent 2 years making all of you afraid of each other, she said. Standing before 40 families who had every reason to hate her, I turned neighbors into enemies, friends into strangers, and a community into isolated, frightened people. But watching what you've built together has shown me what I destroyed and what I have to spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild. When she finished speaking, Harold Peterson stood up and began applauding, followed by every other person in the room. Emma's growth from a frightened teenager into confident young leader became the most rewarding part of our experience. 6 months after therapists, she was accepted to Colorado State University with a full scholarship in cybersecurity. Grandpa, she told Mel when her acceptance letter arrived, I used to think courage meant not being scared. But you taught me that real courage is being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. When people stand together like our neighborhood has, there's nothing that can break us. The final test came 8 months after Vivian's arrest, when 2 black softs appeared at our neighborhood's edge and slowly drove through our streets like predators testing prey. But instead of finding isolated, vulnerable targets, they encountered something unexpected. 12 neighbors immediately emerged from houses armed with cameras and communications equipment, while others contacted federal authorities. The vehicles retreated within minutes, apparently realizing that Maple Grove was no longer the kind of community that could be intimidated. Standing in my front yard that evening, watching neighbors greet each other with genuine warmth that comes from shared adversity and mutual protection, I reflected on what we'd accomplished together. The strength that mattered hadn't come from federal badges or law enforcement authority. It had come from ordinary people who decided to trust each other enough to build something worth defending. When Agent Martinez later called about a potential case in Oregon where elderly residents faced similar intimidation tactics, Emma was first to speak up. Grandpa, what if we could teach other communities how to build the same defense network we built here? Our story had begun with one neighbor's attempt to intimidate and control others, but it ended with understanding that real community strength comes from people who care enough about each other to stand together when standing alone isn't enough. Maple Grove had become proof that ordinary people working together with trust and determining engine can defend themselves against any threat. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe Alex Stories.